Tonight we're going to do a starting video on 1911 trigger jobs, trigger work, basic trigger operation of, like I said, the 1911. My name is Sharky, here on m1911a1.com. To start with, we've got a couple pistols in front of us here. I have two 1911s, a Glock, and a CZ75 Shadow. We're going to run through this basic operation of the trigger on these. This is a bowling pin gun, Caspian. We're going to show clear and take a look at this one. This one here has a really nice trigger pull on it. It measures right at about 2 pounds and it's very crisp. It's a decent trigger for what this gun is intended for. Show you, it has a little bit of pre-travel, some take up. It breaks at 2 pounds and it's super crisp, like I said. Alright, now we will get to reset on this gun. Not much at all does it take to reset. No creep, nice trigger. We're going to move on to the officer's model here. This is not an all-out custom build. It does have a Caspian frame, Colt slide, Colt welded up barrel, aftermarket parts, some checkering done to it, but a nice gun, a little different than the bowling pin gun. We'll show clear on this also. This gun has almost no pre-travel whatsoever. So it also has a 4-pound pull. It breaks really nice also, as in clean and crisp with no creep or no grittiness. This one here has a little more reset. I'd say about 3 times as much reset as the pin gun there, but almost no under travel, like I said, and breaks really nice. We're going to go on to the Glock here. This is a Model 35 Glock that's been reworked extensively, but it still has a typical Glock pull. It's a little spongy. Obviously there's some take up there. This one breaks just at a little under 3 pounds, like 2 3/4 pounds last time I tested it. It's real consistent, always stays, never moves around much. All the internals have been changed or massaged. But it is what it is. It's a Glock trigger, it's spongy. It's a Glock. Next we have a CZ75 Shadow. This one has been to the CZ custom shop. So it has a really nice, well, obviously there's a long amount of travel before you get to the traditional like single action pull. This one has a really nice pull. There is some creep there. I could probably see it as I was pulling it. That's all creep. Check the reset on it. Reset is ways. There is a piece now they make for the CZs where you get less reset, but it is what it is. You can also make these guns into or buy them as single action guns, similar to the 1911s, and you can get them pretty nice. They just don't have as many parts available, and you can't custom tailor to your needs as much as you can in 1911. So now we'll do a double action pull on here. This has one of the nicest double action pulls I've ever pulled on a semi-auto gun. 5-pound double action, 2.5-pound single action. Very nice trigger setup, but it's not to the level of a 1911. Yes, you can make the CZs very close to it, but it's hard to create the same quality of pull, I should say, as you can on 1911. And that's what I'm getting at here, is the availability of not only the aftermarket parts, but just the availability to tune your gun with a trigger job to get the 1911 to do what you want. There's a lot of variables you can do with the 1911. You can control the lengths of, there are so many different styles of trigger itself, excuse me. Long bow, this is a Wilson short bow. There's literally 50 triggers at least out there, different styles. So you can get flats, you can get medium in between the two length, aluminum most of the time. They have titanium, magnesium, plastic. You can get just about everything you want or anything you want to custom fit the shape of the trigger and the length of the trigger to the size of your finger to attain the type of trigger feel that you need for the trigger pull itself. That's one of the beauties, I think, of the 1911. You can definitely adapt it to what you want it to do. So most guns have 1911s have a Overtravel Adjustment screw in there, a set screw, and what that does is it controls the amount of over travel once the hammer falls, it breaks, so you don't have to pull it back as far and release it as far to reset the trigger. Now if you'd like to check out how much or how well that's adjusted, or you got a new gun, you're just curious, go ahead and rock the slide, get the or hammer, pull the hammer back however you like, put your fingers on the hammer itself, pull the trigger, and control that hammer back and forth. Now if you feel the sear dragging that, or anything hitting that or impeding that, which it'll be the sear, then your trigger is over adjusted, and you're going to have to back that out counterclockwise until you just feel nothing at all touching the hammer. Then your over travel is adjusted as far as it can be adjusted. It goes through and it touches actually your mainspring, or your mag catch, excuse me. Now you can also, some guns don't have an over travel adjustment. There's a tang on the beaver tail on the grip safety that can be adjusted farther back. You can actually, if they're brand new and they're oversized, you can adjust it to control the amount of trigger pull. It's kind of a hard way to do it. I'll show it when we do the trigger job, but there is ways, if you have a gun with a trigger that doesn't have that, to go about that. Like I said, there's different styles of triggers. This is the Wilson Ultralight. This one comes with under travel, pre-travel tabs on here, little wings. You fold those out, that pushes the trigger back farther into the gun, so you can eliminate some of that pre-travel. There's some things you have to do to make sure that the disconnector still has enough room to operate, but that's a nice thing to have on a trigger. The triggers in the past never had it. They're just straight bows. Now I slot that and build tabs in there. Both these guns came that way, and I built tabs into both these guns to control some of that pre-travel. This is an all-steel trigger. I'm building a steel gun, so I got an all-steel trigger. They're usually not used anymore because you'll get into what's called a trigger bounce. That's the reason they go to a lighter weight trigger. They do make a sear spring that helps alleviate that trigger bounce, and that is what is called a Clark forefinger sear spring. This is your standard. This is a Colt. On the 3-finger, left touches the sear, the middle touches the disconnector. It also puts pressure on the trigger, but it does it by extra pressure against the disconnector. Whereas the Clark forefinger that has a split middle leg, the right leg is always touching the trigger bow, the left leg is always touching the disconnector. That way you can separate the pressures out between the two different pieces in your gun. This one actually has a forefinger in it, and that's why I have tension on there during that little bit of pre-travel that I have in this gun. Well, actually I like it that way in this gun, but that just alleviates some of the slop in the trigger. So if you have a really sloppy trigger, but you don't want to give it just the maximum amount of, no pre-travel, you want a little pre-travel, Clark forefinger does the job. It also is built originally for the really light trigger jobs in a steel trigger, because you'll get trigger bounce when the hammer, or excuse me, when the slide's hammering forward. It'll cause a little inertia of the trigger, and what it can do is actually knock the sear off the edge of the hammer hooks, and you'll get like a double or a hammer follow. So they invented the split middle leg so that you can always have tension on that, and it eliminated your trigger bounce. Let's take a look at the mainspring now before we get too far here. 1911s run on a mainspring principle, and that the mainspring pushes up onto the strut, which pushes on the hammer and guides it forward with force and hits your firing pin, which ignites the round. I'm getting out of here. I believe the factory mainspring is 23 pounds. This is a 19-pound Ed Brown. You can get away, they make them all the way down to 17 pounds, but everything in your gun has to be really tuned well, really smooth, and no extra slop or anything in there. To get a 17 to work consistently, plus you want to have a lighter firing pin spring, a return spring with like a titanium firing pin. For the really lightweight parts and really competition end of it, a 17-pound mainspring is pretty cool, but about real small. On a regular setup, you'll have misfires. You will not get enough primer strike to ignite it with a 17. Now 18 you can get away with it almost all the time. I run a 19 usually. Sometimes I'll go down to 18 on some guns, but 19 is my standard mainspring. Like I said, I believe factory is 23. You can get them up to 25. I think some guns now actually have like 31 pounders in there. Ungodly amount, but they're trying to do other things. Like I said, I'll get into that further when we get into different styles of trigger jobs. What I'm really getting at here is about every pound that you take off this mainspring, that you go a pound lighter, from let's say a 21 to a 20. They don't make a 20, I believe, but what I'm getting at is every pound you take off, you lose about 4 ounces of trigger pull weight. So guys think, well, I'll just put a 18 pounder in there, and that's a trigger job for me. Well, you will lose like 4 ounces off every pound, but you're not really correcting anything to do with trigger pull. And trigger pull, the main thing with the trigger pull, is controlled by 3 parts besides that mainspring, and also the polish everything, or how everything rubs together in there, because everything touches everything and causes, one little bit of friction adds to another. But what I'm getting here is the main part of a trigger job is the sear, the hammer, and the disconnector. These 3 pieces work in conjunction to do the majority of the trigger pull, felt, what have you, depending on how much take up. Everything is controlled, all these pieces. There's hammer hooks and sear ledge, primary and secondary angles. Some guns don't have a secondary angle. That's what I'll get into in the trigger job. This is really fine, small work, and it's really critical to get it right, as in the engagement angles and surfaces being 100% correct, as to not cause any safety issues and to also give you a good pull. Now, when you get a 1911, most production guns or factory guns run somewhere between 4.5 to 8 pounds. You'll notice when you're pulling the trigger, you'll feel grit in there. It's almost gritty. It's something in there is like rubbing against each other, or there's a lot of creep, which means you can actually feel the sear being pulled off the hammer, and that's creep. And most guys don't like that when they ask to get a trigger job gun, is they want to get away from that creep, and they also like to lighten it up to more consistent pull, maybe a 4-pound range, 3.5 range, or in competition maybe down to a 2.5 pounds. So that can all be done with the trigger job. The reason why they do that in a production gun is they cut the primary angle on the sear at a positive angle. They have tall hammer hooks on there, and that's for safety, so that it can't have any doubles or hammer follow type setup. It's kind of over built that way. They're not. The ledges are usually not very nice. They're definitely not straight. The hammer hooks are definitely not square usually, but they are tall, and it's a safety margin. They'll also put a lot of tension on the sear spring there. But they'll put a lot of tension on the sear leg and also on the disconnector leg, just to make sure that it's safe. So when you go about doing a trigger job, what we're doing is we're taking the overabundance of metal and the extra safe angles and getting them back to a neutral angle, and also lowering hooks and adding a secondary angle, and reducing the mainspring weight, all to try to get a better feeling trigger job. Like I said, we'll get into under travel tabs, and also how you get all the parts to all work together to give you the best feeling trigger job. And that is the beauty of a 1911, is you can hot rod the gun, or you can manipulate it to get whatever you want out of it, whether it be a workhorse or a law enforcement type thing where you do not want a light trigger pull on there, or to a competition gun where you want to be hosing it with a 2-pound pull. The other guns, like I mentioned, some of the striker fires and some of them like the CZ75 are a lot more difficult to do any type of trigger work. I shouldn't say that the striker fires are harder. There's a lot of pieces for the Glock, and they're basically a drop-in. Some of the springs you got to change, some of the things you got to manipulate. But it's actually a really easy trigger job. But it's always going to be a Glock pull. It's never going to be what you can get out of a 1911. I'm not biased against the guns. I love both the guns. I love actually a lot of guns. I am biased towards the 1911 because I know what they can do and what a gunsmith can do for you, or what an average person can do just for a safety and getting a better pull out. So that's what we're going to do in our next videos. We're going to break down the 1911 to what parts actually need work, what work you can do, things to look for in a gun before you go fitting parts, what are the basic hand tools you can use to do a trigger job. You don't have to have a multi-$1,000 CNC setup. You can buy parts that are real close. There really is no such thing as a drop-in part either. You can buy a drop-in trigger pull or trigger set that has a set pull, but every gun is a little bit different. So it may work well for your gun, it may not. It may give you the results that you want, it may not. In reality, like I said, there really is no drop-in parts. They all have to be massaged and fit and checked by a competent gunsmith to get the optimum of what you want out of the guns. So that about covers it for the initial video. We will get into the actual trigger job and the steps necessary to go down that road in the next one. Cool.